Hi everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Harsh Jain. I think there's some issues with the host's video or audio. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of Dream 11, and I'm here to talk a bit about fantasy sports today. So I'd like to walk everyone through. Maybe I can walk you through a quick journey. Fantasy sports began in India in about 2001 with ESPN Super Selector, but shortly after, unfortunately, it stopped in about 2003 because of no product market fit. But in 2008, when IPL started for the first time, we chose to begin Dream 11 after seeing fantasy sports and playing fantasy sports every day for sports like fantasy football. And that's how we started Dream 11 because we wanted to play fantasy cricket for IPL in 2008. And it took us about 4 years to actually find good product market fit, which is the product you see today. We pivoted over 4 years to from a free to play ad driven fantasy sports website to a freemium fantasy sports focused app and mobile web and desktop site at that time. And that's really helped us get that growth scale that we've seen from 2012 to 2020 today. Obviously, one of the big tipping points for the industry was the legal approval that we obtained in I think early 2017. That the Indian High Courts ruled that fantasy sports is a game of skill, is not wagering, betting, gambling, and is a legal business protected under the Article 19(1)(g) of the Constitution of India, and that allowed it to be seen as a regular business, and that allowed it to grow much more. And there began the partnerships with all the leagues and all the celebrities and all the sports athletes. And I'm proud to say that today the fantasy sports industry is now about 200 companies with thousands of jobs and over 12 crore users. So out of the 80 crore Indian sports fans, 12 crore people have already played fantasy sports. And it's been a great journey in the last 8 years after we found product market fit to get to this point. Obviously, the last couple of years have been exponential growth. And that's why we also see in an industry body come together like FIFS, which has been self regulating the fantasy sports industry. IMAI helps as an umbrella body, and but fantasy sports is self-regulated by FIFS, which allows it to speak to the government on every issue, to speak to regulators and help regulate this industry the right way for it to grow even further. The other thing I'd like to talk about today is that a lot of people mix up fantasy sports and gaming, and there's a reason why. Even in an event like Gato, the gaming track and the fantasy sports track or the sports engagement track is very different, is because even though legally it might come under games of skill, but it's counted as a game as much as a sport is counted as a game, as much as a game of cricket or football. It is a sports engagement vehicle. It does not come under casual gaming or other kinds of gaming, and I'll tell you why. It's because that fantasy sports sits on top of a real life event, a real life sports match. There's no simulation. There's it is all dependent on what happens in the real life sports match, where users make a team, and based on how those players in the real event perform, you get points in the game. And so this is not like other forms of gaming where it's simulation and where you can play 24/7. In fantasy sports, it's not gaming because of the simulation part is not existent, and because you can't play 24/7. You can only play when there's an upcoming real life match. And so there's some major distinctions, such as the fact that it's 100% transparent. There's no bots. You can only set up your team, and then the minute the match begins, you can see the other player's team, and you can actually watch real life as a real life match goes on. You can watch live as your team gets points and as opponent's team gets points. So it's 100% transparent. And even when people are playing fantasy sports, 80% of these 12 crore users have only ever played for free. So it's almost overwhelmingly played only for free as a social tool to engage with other sports fans. And even for the paying players, the average ticket size is very low. It's about 35 rupees on average, which is cheaper than a snack or a popcorn for a movie, right? And 50% of people at least win their money back. So the idea is to make it much more engaging and not a high ARPU, low ARPU, high engagement, high actively consumption with the sport that you love, the match that you love. And what we've seen is that 99.6%, I'll repeat, 99.6% of users have never won or lost more than 10,000 rupees net in their lifetime. And I think that says it all, right? Because if you've never in your lifetime won or lost more than net 10,000 rupees, it's obviously this is over years of playing. Obviously, when you're participating in fantasy sports, it's an engagement driven exercise. It's to increase sports engagement and not for gaming. And the other thing I'm proud of saying is that the fantasy sports demographic is also very interesting. Unlike what people think, actually, the majority of players are aged 25 to 40 years old. And so it's not the youth that are playing, but a very mature audience. Um, the other things I can tell you about fantasy sports is that almost 80% of users play for cricket, fantasy cricket, as you might have guessed. But 20% of players, which is like millions of people or crores of users, play fantasy football, basketball, kabaddi, baseball, everything, all the other sports. And because of fantasy sports, these sports outside of cricket in India have seen a massive rise as well. In fact, when I think there was a report which said 59% of people started watching more sports, more new sports, because they were playing fantasy sports. 60% of fantasy sports users watch these sports more because when you make a fantasy sports team, you obviously want to watch the entire match, know how your players are doing, see how your team is doing, and research for the next match. And so 87% of users that play fantasy sports actually end up doing a lot of sports research to figure out which of the teams, which of the players should they take in their team, which of the team can win, and why, right? And finally, I'd like to end with saying that there was a very interesting study done by MIT and Columbia in the US, which actually proved that fantasy sports requires more skill than even mutual funds. And that's actually a great comparison because fantasy sports is for the sports industry what mutual funds are for the equities industry, right? It's about how to invest, how to create a portfolio, and how to get more returns through knowledge and research and making sure that you fully understand what you're selecting, why you're selecting, and how you're selecting. And there's also been case studies by IIM in India which actually show that in a quantified way, not qualitatively but quantified way, they actually prove that fantasy sports are a game of skill, and that people that research and study the sport will always do better than the people that don't. So, with that, I think I've given you a good lowdown about what are fantasy sports, how it works, and what differentiates fantasy sports from gaming, why it's a sports engagement tool that's critical for the growth of sports development in the country and sports consumption. And so, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer any of them. I think I can see a bunch of questions on the chat. Um, there's been an increase. I'm going to read it out. There's been an increase in the user base of fantasy sports due to the lockdown and IPL. Do you think this increased demand will continue in the future as well, or will it decrease? What will be the trend in the future according to you? Actually, during the lockdown from March to maybe August, I want to say, sports worldwide was pretty much shut down. So that's another differentiator, right? Because gaming is simulation based, gaming actually witnessed a major spike, but fantasy sports was only based on sports. And so it only picked up September onwards when sports started coming back. So yes, there's been a big increase in the user base for fantasy sports because of IPL. I'm happy to say, like as most of you might have seen, Dream 11 was the title sponsor of IPL. It was called Dream 11 IPL this year. And I think fantasy sports have really come to the forefront of showing that they can be a very high engagement tool for sports fans. So I think this trend will keep increasing because there's 80 crore sports fans in India, and fantasy sports have only 12 crore users so far. Another question is making innovations and adding variants of the game um, might expose developers to regulatory constraints. How do you think developers can tackle this? Well, I think that as the industry matures, and that's why we have the self-regulatory body called Federation of Indian Fantasy Sports, where we have an empowered panel and eminent people on that panel who will neutrally and in an unbiased way advise the entire industry on what variants can be created, making sure that they are fully legally compliant as a game of skill and it doesn't move towards sports betting. There is only one format which the Indian courts have approved as a game of skill, which is that fantasy sports have to be at least for a whole match. No changes are allowed after the game begins, and you have to take a mix of players from both teams. And for you have to take at least as many players as the real life team has. So, for example, cricket or football have 11 players, so you have to take at least 11 players in your fantasy team. And so, keeping these constraints in mind, there have been variations, there have been innovations, which many operators have started doing, and that's what FIFS helps in. I think we have time for one more question. So, fantasy sports appears to push sports to the public in general beyond just targeting the demography of active gamers. Beyond that narrative, how does this growth sustain bringing non-gamers into the fold? That's what I'm saying. That this is not about gaming. You don't play fantasy sports if you have 5 minutes or if you're in a cab or if you have 5 minutes to kill generally. To play fantasy sports, you have to actually understand which match is being played, what are the pitch conditions, what are the lineups, what is the form of each player, what is the team form, what's going to probably happen, who's going to play well on a certain what the weather is like. And so there's 100 variables to consider, and so it's not for gamers. You're targeting the sports fan, not the gamer. So the idea is to bring all the 80 crore sports fans to move from passively engaging with sports into active engagement with sports through fantasy sports. We've been watching sports for like 50 years. The consumption of sports is barely changed from radio to TV, right? You're still just watching it. Fantasy sports allows you to actively participate in the sports match. Great. I think I'm out of time.
Yes, thank you, Harsh, for that great insight into industry. We also thank you for making time out of your busy schedule for this event. With that, we come to the end of this session. Everyone, please stay logged in for the other interesting sessions in this event. Stay safe. Goodbye from our end.
Thank you. Stay safe. Goodbye.